And so, after a long time, it's time to finish off this mini documentary series on the Battle of Mons. So, let's finally get into it. Now, before we talk about some of the action that takes place in the battle proper, I believe it's time for a little recap of where we are so far in the story of the First World War leading up to the Battle of Mons. In August 1914, the First World War is less than a month old. All of Europe's major nations are at war, and in two camps. On one side, the Triple Entente, or otherwise known as the Allies, and the other, the Central Powers. All of this was triggered by a certain assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, and with Austro-Hungarian ambitions of territorial expansion in the Balkans in full swing, they used this unfortunate event as an excuse to declare war and invade Serbia. Thus, the house of cards of ambitions and complexed interweaved alliances, forcing belligerent nations to cultivate a Balkan War into a world war. Now, to prevent matters from getting too complex for this video, and to stay relevant in regard to the story of the Battle of Mons, I will stick to the Western Front. Though in the future I would love to cover some elements of the Eastern Front and how both fronts influenced each other, which is really fascinating when you dig into it. Right, leading up to the clash at Mons, the Imperial German Army has implemented the Schlieffen Plan, a heavy-weighted siding thrust through Belgium and into France. However, the act of invading Belgium is in violation of Belgian neutrality, and the treaty which was to protect that neutrality, of which then brought the British Empire into the war on August 4th. By August 7th, the BEF lands in France made up of two corps, and under the overall command of Field Marshal Sir John French. And the BEF, once it lands in France, makes its way to Belgium and alongside the left flank of the French Fifth Army. And the French at this time are enacting their plan, Plan 17, which is their plan to recapture the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine. However, this is known as the Battle of the Frontiers. However, this wasn't going to be successful, which is not good news in our story of the BEF and the Germans fighting at Mons. Speaking of the Battle of Mons, the BEF entered the mining town around 0100 hours on the 23rd of August with a force of around 80,000 men. Second Corps, under the command of General Smith-Dorrien, set up defensive positions along the Mons-Condé Canal, a frontage of around 43 kilometres. An issue for the BEF, however, is that there's a gap between the BEF itself and the French Fifth Army. To cover this, a thin skirmish line was formed on the right flank. Another issue with this defence was that the canal on the right flank especially formed as salient. If a German attack hit hard on the right, the British positions would be attacked on three sides, let alone the potential exploitation of the gap between the British and French armies. However, the BEF would not have to wait long to see action, as von Kluck's First Army was steamrolling its way towards them. Reports from reconnaissance flights made by the young Royal Flying Corps made note of large German formations heading towards them. All the while, Sir John French held the view of taking the offensive, despite aerial intelligence and an officer ringing various train stations to see if the operator answered in German or not, which was an amusing and ingenious idea that I learned, I believe, from one of the Battle Guide virtual tours. The bit of fighting ahead is not too far in the future for both sides. At first light on 23rd of August, German cavalry probed 2nd Corps' forward positions. The 4th Royal Fusiliers engaged an Ulan patrol and took a prisoner. According to my notes, the chap who was captured was Lieutenant von Arnim, a scene that was somewhat referenced in the BBC's Our World War. A quick side note, Our World War, especially the first episode, I really enjoyed, and it was good to have seen the early phase of the war featured on film rather than going straight into the Battle of the Somme and trench warfare. I would love to see more from the opening months of the First World War that shows what the war was like before trench warfare took hold. Because the war of movement prior to the race to the sea was a fascinating phase of the war. Anyway, back to the matters at hand. Around 10:30 hours, German artillery opened up on British positions. Over the next few hours, the rest of the German forces collide with the British positions in a series from the British right to the British left, along the rest of the Mons-Condé Canal. The German assault was a far heavier punch than the BEF anticipated. Estimations prior of the German forces from the British Higher Command stated that the BEF would have to face around 2 corps and a cavalry division. Instead, what hit them was the equivalent of 3 corps, which is 6 divisions with cavalry that collided into the 2 divisions of the BEF's 2nd Corps. Apparently, the Germans initially marched in a massed formation at the British lines and were swiftly cut down by machine gun and accurate rifle fire. The German forces fell back, regrouped, and advanced again, but this time in a looser skirmish formation, as well as bringing forward machine guns of their own to pour fire at the British positions in kind. As the day wore on, superior numbers began to tell against 2nd Corps, as the Germans managed to force their way across the canal in some places, mainly on the British right, and put pressure on the British regulars. Right then, there are a few episodes of heroism for both belligerents. First, I'll bring up the action of a German soldier during the assault of a swing bridge near Nîmes. The chap in question was Private Oskar Neymar. He swam across the canal, under fire, and operated the bridge controls to align the bridge so that his comrades could cross the bridge and assault. However, as soon as the bridge aligns with the German-controlled side of the canal, he was killed. For his actions, he was later posthumously awarded the Iron Cross. Nearby, on the Nîmes rail bridge, the Royal Fusiliers earned themselves 2 Victoria Crosses, Lieutenant Maurice Dease and Private Sidney Godley, both operating the machine gun, but not at the same time. Lieutenant Dease was wounded several times before he finally succumbed to the injuries on his person, whilst Godley was tasked in covering the retreat of the Fusiliers from the bridge and being wounded in the head, after which he spiked the Vickers machine gun. He claims by throwing the gun into the canal. However, some historians find that hard to believe considering the state he would have been in. But it is most likely he removed the fire mechanism and threw that into the canal. I'll link the Battle Guide's video in the description. Around 1300 hours, the situation for the BEF was becoming rather dire. Little in the way of artillery support, in the process of being outflanked by the German forces exploiting a gap between the BEF and the retreating French Fifth Army, and successful German crossings of the canal, it was time for the BEF to fall back and retreat before it was too late. Generally, falling back whilst in contact with the enemy is an extremely difficult process to conduct. However, the remaining forces of the All Contemptibles would have to perform this action. Looking back towards the Royal Fusiliers at Nîmes Bridge, Godley was now manning the Vickers machine gun, covering his comrades as they fell back into Mons. This was when, as I mentioned previous, he was wounded and spiked the machine gun before being taken prisoner. Looking over at the diehards, they too fell back. Captain Glass of D Company was wounded by machine gun fire, shattering his legs, propped up against a wall. And here we have the story of a lone Tommy atop a roof firing at the advancing Germans. There is a plaque that marks the heroic occasion where this chap supposedly was fighting and killed. As far as I can gather, it is another of those stories that could have happened, but also maybe not have. But history is full of tales of truth, fabrications, and fabrications around truths. A modern example being the Ghost of Kiev. The BEF managed to fall back and engage in a fighting withdrawal. The Great Retreat has begun. To ensure that the roads were not to be overburdened, The two corps of the BEF took separate roads. Generally, you would not want to split your forces in the face of the enemy, as this opens up the possibility of being defeated in detail. However, the BEF managed to get away with it, but barely. Thanks to various cavalry actions and episodes of more desperate fighting against German advance guards and fighting them to a standstill, this allowed the BEF to survive, until, that is, 2nd Corps was forced into a bitter fight yet again at Le Cateau. Smith-Dorrien felt the German presence was dangerously too close to his forces and decided, against the judgment of Sir John French, to halt 2nd Corps and fight. In hindsight, this appears to have been a smart move, despite the grave danger of the destruction of 2nd Corps in the process. The action at Le Cateau pitted the depleted survivors of the Mons battle once again against the advancing army of von Kluck, and in this action arguably saved the BEF and ensured that France would not stand alone in the later Battle of the Marne, which halted and turned back the German invasion. In future, I will go into more detail on the Battle of Le Cateau, as it is an important step in the opening stages of the war on the Western Front, and showcased what a small professional and well-trained force can do, the proverbial rapier among scythes. That was a brief look at the Battle of Mons. I hope this has piqued your interest to look into the battle and this opening few months of the First World War. I do encourage you to look up at this brief period because it is a war of movement, armies blundering into each other and learning how to engage one another in open battle. It is truly a fascinating time, just before the onset of trench warfare. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this terribly made documentary. Any mistakes and misinterpretations are my own to have made, and my references and sources that I used are in the description. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.